So the next thing we're going to talk about are all the different values that ecosystems have. And we're going to start with use values. So these are called instrumental or utilitarian values. And the first part of that is direct use. And these are probably the most obvious types of uses of ecosystems. So I'm going to start with direct use of ecosystems. So these are consumptive use values. Goods derived from the environment for personal use. And so examples of this might be like gathering firewood that you're going to burn in your own house. If you went fishing in a local river or pond and you brought it home and ate it. Wild game or bushmeat, if you went and collected berries, mushrooms, collected fresh water. And traditional medicines. So these are goods that people go out and gather and use in their own homes. They're not selling them, they're using them themselves. So that's called consumptive use values. And these are some examples. Probably around here, the most likely things that you would be doing is fishing. You might collect firewood, but most people don't do that anymore. And you might go collect berries. So like if I go pick blackberries on the side of the road or in a forest or wildlife management area or something like that, that would be a consumptive use value if I eat them in my own home. And in a lot of rural areas, these sorts of things are very important for increasing people's standard of living. It supplements people's diets and means that they don't have to spend as much of the real income that they generate on these other services and goods that they need. A lot of local customs promote sustainable use of many consumptive use resources. And so a value can be assigned to this by determining how much it would cost to get that resource if they weren't able to just go get it themselves. And we call this the replacement cost approach. So people aren't actually gathering these things and selling them. That's not what consumptive use value is. But if they had to go out and buy fish instead of catching it in a local river, we can estimate the value by what they would have to do if that resource went away. And in a lot of cases, people would not be able to afford the replacement costs. So if they had to go buy all their fish that they were going to eat instead of catching it out of the nearby river, they might just have to go without. A second kind of direct use is called productive use value. And these are goods derived from the environment that are sold. So if I went and fished from the river and then sold the fish, that would be productive use value. Whereas if I used it in my own home, that would be consumptive use value. So that's the difference between the two. So these are things that are being sold. And they may be sold directly or used in the manufacture of goods. And there's a lot of things that we think about for these. So seafood is probably the most obvious. People go out with fishing boats, they gather fish and other types of seafood from the ocean, and they bring it back and sell it. So that is a really obvious productive use value. It also includes things like wild meat and skins, timber. This isn't necessarily timber grown on tree farms. These are if they went in a forest and cut down trees. Medicinal plants, wild fruits and vegetables, fibers, honey is one, dyes, seaweed, hay, plant gums and resins, horticultural plants, and then a lot of animals for zoos and pets are taken directly from ecosystems, and that would be considered a productive use value as well. So just to go into a little more detail with some of these, forest products, wood is one of the major products from natural environments, and there are some people that study forestry in this class, and so they probably are much more of an expert on this than I am. I've studied how forestry impacts wildlife, but I don't actually study forestry as how we generate value from timber production. The export value is around $231 billion, so it's a big business. And if you include all wood products, including the ones locally used, it's about $400 billion. There's lots of other forest products that can rival the value of wood in some areas. Might include game, resins, fruit, sap, vines, medicines. Probably the best example in the United States is maple syrup. And in the Northeast, you'll see things that look like this, like if you're just driving down the road, you'll see these tubes connected to the trees all along the side of the road. My husband grew up in New Hampshire, and when we go up and visit his family, we often will see all these tubes. And so maple syrup is basically maple tree sap that is boiled down, and Canada exports about $360 million a year in maple syrup. The Northeast, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, they make a lot of maple syrup as well. Other examples include medicines. Most medicinal advances can be traced back to wild organisms, many in plants. And so they'll be found in wild plants and then propagated in captivity. And sometimes the chemicals are synthesized in a lab, but a lot of times those chemicals were first discovered in an organism in a natural ecosystem. And also, I want to talk briefly about option value. This is different than productive use value, but when we talk about medicine, we don't know what future medical breakthroughs are out there. There's a lot of plants and animals and other types of organisms that we don't know much about, and a lot of them have really interesting chemicals that could be used in the development of new medicines. And so this is one reason a lot of people promote conserving, especially tropical rainforests, because there's so much biodiversity in a tropical rainforest that there could be all kinds of medical breakthroughs in every acre of rainforest because there are just so many species there. And the question is always, will we make the discoveries in time? Like, what are we losing when we lose different ecosystems? Could we be losing really important new compounds that could help us deal with different medical conditions that people have, or different diseases that we're having to deal with? Also inventions. We might not be able to discover chemicals that can help us solve all sorts of different problems. So I just wanted to give you some examples of some medicines, and these are all come from plants. Most antibiotics come from fungi and microorganisms. So you probably all know that penicillin comes from bread mold. And many drugs were developed from compounds found in plants. So meadowsweet, which is this top plant, is responsible for aspirin. Most of you probably know about codeine and morphine come from the opium poppies. The coca plant, novocaine and lidocaine, comes from this plant. And rose periwinkle, which is very commonly sold now in garden stores, is part of a drug for childhood leukemia. Also, sometimes we make really interesting new inventions that also can be important for medicines. There's a bacterium in Yellowstone National Park that has the enzyme for PCR. So we would probably not know very much about genetics if somebody hadn't discovered this important enzyme that this bacterium has in Yellowstone National Park. And before I go on, I just wanted to say that there are lots and lots of organisms that have really interesting chemical compounds in their tissues, or that make interesting chemical compounds. There are lots of new drugs being developed from snake venom, because snake venom has so many different compounds. There are poison dart frogs that have all kinds of interesting chemicals. There's a lot of insects that make different chemicals, and a lot of those are being used to develop new drugs for heart disease and for cancer and lots of different conditions that people suffer from.